In the bitter, snow-blown landscape of southern Russia, in February of 1943, the German Wehrmacht was not just in retreat, it was in a state of full-blown, catastrophic collapse. The invincible Sixth Army, the pride of the Third Reich, had just been annihilated at Stalingrad. Its 91,000 survivors, skeletal, frostbitten ghosts, were being marched into the Gulag. The entire southern wing of the Eastern Front had been torn open, and the Red Army, sensing a killing blow, was advancing with a speed and fury that was terrifying. Soviet tank armies, no longer a disorganized rabble, but a confident, battle-hardened force, were smashing through the overstretched German lines, retaking city after city. They recaptured Kharkov, a key industrial center, and were pushing hard towards the Dnieper River. For a moment, it seemed that the entire German war effort in the East was on the verge of unraveling. Just one more Soviet push away from a defeat so total it could end the war. But the Wehrmacht was not yet broken. And in this moment of supreme crisis, one man stepped in to orchestrate one of the most brilliant and often overlooked counteroffensives of the entire war. That man was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the commander of the newly formed Army Group South. Manstein, an aristocratic, ice-cold strategic genius, saw the Soviet advance not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. He saw that the Red Army, in its exhilarating rush forward, was doing exactly what the Germans had done a year before. It was overextending its supply lines. Its armored spearheads were running low on fuel and ammunition, and its infantry was struggling to keep up. In a series of masterful maneuvers that would be studied for decades, Manstein did not try to stop the Soviet onslaught. He sidestepped it. He let the Soviet spearheads punch into open air, and then, in what became known as the backhand blow, he gathered his elite, battle-hardened SS Panzer Corps and smashed them into the Red Army's exposed northern flank. The result, in what became the Third Battle of Kharkov, was a stunning German victory. The overextended Soviet armies were cut to pieces, and Manstein's panzers, in a bloody reversal, retook the city. By March of 1943, the front line had stabilized. But this victory, this brilliant counterpunch, had not created a straight line. Instead, it had left a massive, glaring bulge in the front, a salient 150 miles long and 100 miles deep, centered around the city of Kursk. To the north, the Germans held a salient around Orel. To the south, they held Kharkov. And in the middle, pointing like a giant thumb into the German lines, was the Kursk salient, packed with the elite of the Red Army. As the spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, turned the Russian steppe into an ocean of impassable mud, both sides paused. The guns fell silent, and the generals gathered around their maps. To every single officer in the German High Command, from Hitler in his Wolfslair headquarters in Rastenburg to the divisional commanders huddled in their command posts, that bulge on the map was an obsession. It was an obvious, tantalizing target. Military doctrine demanded that it be eliminated. A child could see the plan: launch one massive pincer attack from the north, out of the Orel salient, and another massive pincer from the south, out of the Kharkov salient. The two spearheads would meet in the middle at Kursk, cutting off the entire Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts. It would be a classic Kesselschlacht, an encirclement battle. It would be another Kiev, another Vyazma. It would, they believed, destroy the Red Army's offensive capability for the rest of the year, restore the strategic initiative to the Wehrmacht, and finally, decisively, win the war in the East. The plan was codenamed Operation Citadel, and on paper, it was to be the most powerful offensive ever assembled in human history. This would not be a desperate, overstretched gamble like Stalingrad. This time, Hitler and the German High Command decided to stack the deck. They would wait. They would delay the offensive from May until June, and then until July, using the precious spring months to strip every other front and concentrate an unheard of amount of elite manpower and new technology for this single, decisive blow. Nearly 1 million men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 2,000 aircraft were painstakingly assembled. And this would not be just an army of battle-worn Panzer IVs. Hitler was betting everything on his new generation of Wunderwaffen, or Wunderwaffens, which were just beginning to roll off the production lines. The first was the Panzer V, the Panther. In the eyes of many experts, the Panther was the single finest tank design of the entire war. It was a direct answer to the Soviet T-34, copying its brilliantly sloped armor, but mounting a far superior, high-velocity 75mm gun that could kill a T-34 from over a mile away. It was fast, it was lethal, and it was the future of the Panzer divisions. But it was also new. The first production models were being rushed to the front, their crews barely trained, their gearboxes and fuel pumps notoriously prone to mechanical failure. The second was the Panzer VI, the Tiger. This was the beast of legend, an 88mm cannon on tracks, its frontal armor so thick that virtually no Allied or Soviet shell could penetrate it. The Tiger was a psychological weapon, a mobile fortress designed to instill terror and anchor the assault. The third was the Ferdinand, or Elephant, a monstrous 200-ton tank destroyer built on a failed Porsche Tiger chassis. It carried a massive 88mm gun, even more powerful than the Tigers, and was encased in an impregnable 200mm of frontal steel armor. It was, in theory, an indestructible bunker buster. This was the force that would strike at Kursk, an army of veterans bolstered by a new generation of technologically unmatched super tanks. But even as this force gathered, a high-stakes, bitter debate was raging within the German high command. Not everyone was convinced this was a good idea. Erich von Manstein, the victor of Kharkov, argued passionately that they must strike in May, immediately as the ground dried, before the Soviets had time to prepare. But Hitler, fixated on his new Panthers, delayed, wanting to wait until he had at least 200 of them at the front. Then came the most chilling warning, from the one man who knew German armor better than anyone, General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg and the newly appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops. Guderian was horrified by Citadel. He saw it as a reckless, suicidal gamble. He argued that the Panther was too new, too unreliable, and that the entire plan was a foolish frontal assault against what was obviously the strongest part of the Soviet line. In a famous, heated conference with Hitler, Guderian made his case, concluding with a desperate, prophetic plea. "It is a pointless attack," he said. "We are sacrificing our last reserves. How do you know the Russians will even be where we are attacking? And what if they are?" Hitler, however, was immovable. The attack would proceed. But Guderian's question, "How do you know the Russians will even be there?" was already being answered, not in Berlin, but in Moscow. For as the Germans were planning their secret offensive, they were living in a state of total, catastrophic ignorance. They believed they were preparing a surprise attack. They had no idea that they were, in fact, walking into the single greatest intelligence trap of the Second World War. The Soviets didn't just suspect an attack was coming at Kursk. They knew. They knew everything. They knew the pincer plan. They knew the designated army groups. They knew the individual panzer divisions. They knew the daily situation reports from German high command. They even knew the technical specifications and production numbers of the new Panther and Tiger tanks. And this perfect, godlike knowledge was flowing to Moscow from a web of sources so secret and so perfect that it remains controversial to this day. This was the real battle of Kursk, the one fought in the shadows months before a single tank fired its gun. And it was a battle the Germans had already lost. The German belief in the security of Operation Citadel was a delusion of breathtaking proportions, while Hitler and his generals debated the timing of their surprise attack. A torrent of perfect, detailed intelligence was flowing directly into the Kremlin, landing on the desk of Iosif Stalin himself. This intelligence was so accurate and so timely that Soviet high command, known as Stavka, didn't just have a general idea of German intentions. They had what amounted to a carbon copy of the entire German operational plan. This near-omniscient view came from a web of sources, but two in particular were so effective they single-handedly shaped the outcome of the battle before it began. The first, and most famous, was a spy network, operating out of neutral Switzerland, codenamed Lucy. At the center of this ring was a mysterious figure named Rudolf Rössler, a German émigré with seemingly impossible connections deep inside the German high command, the OK in Berlin. Rössler, a publisher by trade, was not a typical spy. He claimed to be in contact with a group of disaffected, high-ranking German officers who were systematically feeding him plans, situational reports, and strategic directives, which he then passed to the Soviets. For decades, the identity of his sources, codenamed Werther, Teddy, and Olga, remained one of the war's greatest mysteries. But their information was pure gold. Throughout the spring of 1943, Lucy provided Savka with a running commentary on the German buildup, identifying the exact army groups and panzer corps being moved into position at Orel and Kharkov. But even the Lucy ring paled in comparison to the second source, a pipeline of information so secret that Stalin himself may not have known its true origin. This source was in Great Britain. At a Victorian country mansion called Bletchley Park, a team of brilliant British mathematicians, including Alan Turing, had achieved the impossible. They had cracked the German Enigma machine. More than that, they had broken the Lorenz cipher, a far more complex system used for the highest level communications between Hitler, the OKW in Berlin, and his army group commanders on the front line. This meant the British were reading the Führer's personal mail. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was the single most valuable secret of the war, and a portion of it was being systematically leaked to Moscow. The leak came from a man named John Cairncross, a member of the infamous Cambridge 5 spy ring, who was working at Bletchley Park and was a devout, high-level Soviet agent. Every day, Cairncross would smuggle out decrypted German high command messages and pass them to his KGB handlers. This meant that when Hitler and his generals debated the number of Panther tanks, or the exact date for the offensive, first May, then June, then finally July 5th, Stalin was reading those same reports, often just 48 hours later. The Germans were planning their offensive in a locked, soundproof room, unaware that the Soviets were listening to every word through a microphone hidden in the wall. Armed with this perfect intelligence, a monumental debate took place within Stavka in Moscow. It was a debate that would decide the fate of the war. A number of senior Soviet commanders, including General Nikolai Batutin of the Voronezh Front, were flushed with the victory at Stalingrad. They were confident, aggressive, and thirsty for revenge. They argued passionately for a preemptive strike. Why wait for the Germans to attack? Why not use their own massive armored reserves to smash the German buildup at Orel and Kharkov before the offensive could even begin? It was a tempting, classic Soviet doctrine, atakovat, attack. But one man, the most important of them all, disagreed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the harsh, brilliant architect of the victories at Moscow and Stalingrad, saw the situation with a cold, clear, strategic eye. Zhukov, now the Deputy Supreme Commander, wrote a now legendary memo to Stalin on April 8, 1943. He argued that a preemptive attack was a gamble. It would mean striking the Germans where they were strongest and best prepared, wasting Soviet strength in a bloody head-on collision. He proposed a radically different and profoundly un-Soviet strategy. Let them attack. Let the Germans, with their new Tigers and Panthers, smash themselves to pieces against a prepared defense of unparalleled depth. Let them bleed their elite panzer divisions white. And then, only when they were exhausted, broken, and overextended, unleash the full, unblunted power of the Red Army's strategic reserves in a massive counteroffensive that would not just stop them, but annihilate them. It was a staggering gamble. It required nerves of steel, a willingness to absorb terrifying initial losses, and a monumental feat of engineering. Stalin, a man who had built his career on brutal offensive action, considered the options. For once he chose patience. He sided with Zhukov. The decision was made. The Red Army would not attack. It would wait. It would dig. It would prepare a trap, a fortress so vast and so deadly that it would swallow the Wehrmacht's last great offensive whole. The plan was called Obrona Defense, and what the Soviets built in the 90 days from April to July was, and remains, the single largest and most complex defensive network in the history of warfare. The entire 150-mile-long front of the salient was to be transformed into a gigantic, multi-layered kill zone. This was not a single trench line. It was a defense in depth that stretched back over 100 miles. If the Germans broke the first line, they would only find a second, equally strong line. If they broke that, they would find a third, and a fourth, and so on, all the way back to Kursk. The numbers defy imagination, and they must be written out to be understood. Under the direction of Soviet military engineers, over 300,000 civilians, mostly women, children, and old men, were conscripted from the surrounding villages and put to work with shovels. They worked day and night, digging over 3,000 miles of trenches, enough to stretch from Moscow to London and back. They built thousands of reinforced concrete bunkers, command posts, and observation points. But the true teeth of the defense were the anti-tank system. First came the mines. The Soviets created the largest minefields in history, over 500,000 anti-tank mines, and nearly 450,000 anti-personnel mines were laid, creating a mine density of over 2,400 anti-tank mines per mile of front. In the most threatened sectors, this density doubled to nearly 5,000 mines per mile. This meant the German panzers would not be rolling across an open steppe. They would be creeping through a garden of death, where every yard of ground could be their last. Second, and most critically, was the artillery. The Soviets massed a staggering 20,000 guns and mortars, but they did not just place them along the front. They pre-sighted every single gully, every crossroads, every hill, and every field. These were the killing grounds. The entire salient was a pre-plotted artillery grid. The moment a German panzer unit entered one of these zones, a signal would go up, and a storm of high explosive and armor-piercing shells from hundreds of hidden, dug-in guns would rain down upon them. Finally, there was the POC front. This was the revolutionary Soviet doctrine, the anti-tank front. Instead of scattering their anti-tank guns, the Soviets concentrated them in anti-tank strong points, or prototankovo opornie punkty. These were nests of 10 to 15 anti-tank guns, dug in, camouflaged, and protected by their own minefields and machine gun crews. These strong points were placed to create interlocking fields of fire, like a spider's web. A German Tiger, advancing and feeling invincible, might bypass one strong point, only to expose its thinner side armor to another, hidden strong point half a mile away. The entire German advance was being deliberately channeled into these packed front kill zones. As the German reconnaissance planes flew over the salient in May and June, their photographs began to reveal a terrifying reality. The empty fields they had planned to drive across were now scarred with endless, zigzagging lines of trenches and fortifications. The German high command, including Hitler, saw these reports. They knew the element of surprise was gone. Yet, in a fatal display of hubris, they convinced themselves it didn't matter. They believed their new Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands were so technologically superior that they would simply brush these primitive Russian defenses aside. They believed the Untermensch was incapable of such sophisticated defensive planning. They were wrong. They were not preparing to fight a battle. They were preparing to march, heads down, into a scientifically engineered machine built for one purpose: to kill panzers. In the pre-dawn blackness of July 5th, 1943, nearly 1 million German soldiers lay in their assembly trenches, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. This was it. For weeks, they had been told that this offensive, Operation Citadel, would be the Entscheidungsschlacht, the decisive battle. They were the most powerful, best-equipped army the Reich had ever fielded. An iron fist of Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands, poised to crush the subhuman Soviets and regain the initiative. At exactly 3:30 a.m., the German signal for the attack, a storm of steel, erupted. 2,000 German aircraft roared into the sky. Thousands of artillery pieces and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers opened up, sending a tidal wave of high explosives crashing down on the first line of Soviet trenches. The ground shook for 50 miles. For the German soldiers, it was a terrifying, awe-inspiring display of their own power. But then, something impossible happened. At approximately 2:20 a.m., over an hour before the German barrage was set to begin, the dead Soviet front had suddenly, apocalyptically, come to life. Acting on perfect last-minute intelligence from captured German sappers and frontline defectors, the Soviet artillery commanders of the Central and Voronezh fronts had given the order to fire. In a deafening, rolling thunder that dwarfed the German bombardment, over 3,000 Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed a preemptive counter-preparation barrage. This wasn't a random shelling. It was a targeted, systematic destruction of the German assembly areas. For the German soldiers, huddled shoulder to shoulder in their jump-off positions, it was a nightmare. The sky tore open above them before their own attack had even started. This storm of Soviet steel ripped into their packed infantry formations, hammered their forward-deployed panzer units, and, most critically, shattered their command and control. Telephone wires were vaporized. Radio operators screamed into dead receivers. German forward artillery observers, who were supposed to be directing the main assault, were killed in their bunkers before they could even look through their binoculars. It was the first moment of realization. For the Wehrmacht, the enemy knew they were coming. They knew the day, they knew the hour, and they were ready. The German attack proceeded anyway, but it was now a disorganized, disjointed, and desperate push. The assault in the north, led by Field Marshal Walter Model's Ninth Army, was a disaster from the first yard. Model's objective was to smash through General Rokossovsky's central front, a sector the Soviets had, with perfect foresight, identified as the most likely and most dangerous. Rokossovsky had turned his front into a fortress. Model's men were advancing into the deepest, most densely mined, and most heavily fortified sector of the entire salient. Leading the charge were the 60-ton Ferdinand tank destroyers of the 656th Heavy Tank Destroyer Regiment. On paper, these were invincible. Their 200mm frontal armor was immune to every anti-tank gun on the battlefield, but the Soviets, armed with perfect intelligence on their specifications, had devised a simple, brutal counter. They let the Ferdinands advance, watching as their enormous weight and narrow tracks caused them to bog down in the soft earth, or, more often, have their tracks blown off by the thousands of anti-tank mines. Once Ferdinand was immobilized, it was a sitting duck. In a fatal design flaw that haunts its legacy, the Ferdinand had been built with no machine guns. It was a giant with no fists. Soviet infantry, whom the Germans called tankadesantniki, would swarm the helpless behemoths. They would climb onto the engine deck, douse it with gasoline, and set it ablaze, or simply blast it with satchel charges until the crew was forced to bail out. Of the 90 Ferdinands that started the attack, nearly half were lost in the first few days. Most of them not destroyed by enemy guns, but abandoned after being immobilized by mines. Behind this failed spearhead, Model's infantry and Panzer IVs slammed into Rokossovsky's pack front. It was a meat grinder. The Germans, expecting to fight a mobile battle, were instead fighting a World War I-style frontal assault against a defense of unimaginable depth and density. Every hill was a pre-sighted artillery kill zone. Every field was a minefield. Every gully held a dozen dug-in, camouflaged T-34 tank turrets. Model's advance was measured not in miles, but in yards. After 7 days of horrific, grinding, and costly battle, the Ninth Army, the Northern Pincer, had advanced a total of 7 miles. It had bled itself white and had failed to break even the second of the 8 Soviet defensive belts. The Northern Pincer Citadel was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Here, the assault was led by the true elite of the Wehrmacht, Field Marshal Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, which included the fanatical, lavishly equipped 2nd SS Panzer Corps. This was the main effort, the true spearhead of Citadel, and it was here that Hitler's new Wunderwaffen were concentrated. The attack began with the debut of the Panther tank, and at first, it was a catastrophe. Of the 200 brand new Panthers of the 10th Panzer Brigade, one of 68 had been operational on the evening of July 4th. By the morning of July 5th, After simply driving the few miles to their assembly areas, only 80 were still running. The rest were broken down, their complex gearboxes and fuel injection systems having failed before firing a single shot. Those that did make it into battle, however, were terrifying. Their sloped armor proved highly effective, and their long 75mm guns were a revelation, knocking out T-34s at ranges the Soviets thought were safe. Hulst's assault, unlike models, had weight and momentum. Led by the Tigers of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, the southern pincer tore into the defenses of General Vatutin's Voronezh front. Here, the fighting was not a static grind. It was a swirling, desperate, and unbelievably brutal brawl. The Germans were advancing, but they were paying for every single yard in blood and steel. They were not bouncing off the Soviet defenses. They were pushing through them. But the POK front was working exactly as Zhukov had planned. The Tigers and Panthers were indeed lethal, but the PAK front was designed to absorb them. The Tiger, advancing with confidence, would be hit from the front by a 76mm shell, which would bounce off its thick armor. But as its turret traversed to find that gun, it would be hit from the flank by a second, hidden gun, and then a third. The Germans were being forced to fight in 3 dimensions, engaging dozens of hidden, dug-in targets at once. The panzer crews, used to a war of movement, were trapped in a disorienting 30-60-degree knife fight. Over the next 5 days, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, in a display of tactical skill and raw fanaticism, did what Model's army in the north could not. They broke through. They smashed the 1st Soviet defensive line. They ground their way through the 2nd. By July 11th, they had pushed a 40-mile deep wedge into Vatutin's front and were on the verge of a true operational breakthrough. They had been bled white. Their panzer strength was reduced by more than half, but they were through the main defensive belts. They now stood on the high ground near a small, insignificant farming village. The village's name was Prokhorovka. General Vatutin, his front on the verge of collapsing, sent a series of panicked, desperate messages to Stavka in Moscow. He had nothing left to stop Hoth's panzers. The POK front was broken. The artillery was falling back. The trap had failed. But Zhukov and Stalin had been holding one last, massive card in their hand. It was their trump, the entire Red Army Strategic Reserve, which had been held back, untouched, for this exact moment. It was the 5th Guards Tank Army, a fresh, elite force of over 850 tanks, including 500 new T-34s. On July 9th, Stalin gave the order to commit them. For 3 days and 3 nights, the 5th Guards Tank Army force marched, traveling over 200 miles to arrive at Prokhorovka, its engines roaring, its crews grim, just as the lead elements of the SS Panzer Corps were cresting the horizon. The stage was now set for the most famous and most misunderstood tank battle in history. The morning of July 12, 1943, dawned hot and dusty. On the rolling wheat fields around Prokhorovka, 2 of the most powerful armored forces ever assembled were on a collision course. On the German side, the exhausted but elite panzer divisions of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, were preparing to make their final, decisive push. They had bled for a week, they had broken 2 defensive lines, and they believed they were finally in the open. Opposing them, and having just arrived after a grueling 3-day march, was General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. Rotmistrov, a fiery and aggressive commander, had given his men a simple, brutal order. He knew his T-34 tanks were outclassed by the long-range guns of the Tigers and Panthers. To fight them at a distance was suicide. His order was to charge, to close the distance at all costs, to get in close, inside the lethal 1,000-meter kill zone, where the T-34's own 76mm gun could finally be effective. His crews were told to aim for the flanks, to fire at point-blank range, and, if necessary, to ram the enemy. What followed was not a battle. It was a confused, hellish, and chaotic melee. This was not the greatest tank battle in history, as it is often mythologized. A chivalrous, long-range duel in the open. It was a point-blank brawl, fought in a blinding cloud of dust, smoke, and fire. The lead elements of the 5th Guards Tank Army, nearly 500 tanks, surged forward in a massive wave, their infantry clinging to the hulls. The German panzer crews, preparing for their own attack, were stunned. They watched in disbelief as the horde of T-34s simply kept coming, driving straight into the muzzles of their superior guns. The long-range 75mm guns of the Panthers and the 88mm cannons of the Tigers began to take a horrific toll. T-34s were hit from 800 meters, then 500, then 200, exploding in massive fireballs. The Soviets kept coming. They crashed into the German lines, and the battle dissolved from a planned engagement into a series of desperate individual duels. T-34s swarmed the lumbering Tigers, crews firing wildly as they sped past, trying to get a shot at their vulnerable side or rear armor. Some T-34 commanders, their guns useless against a Tiger's front, literally rammed their tanks into the German behemoths, sacrificing themselves to shatter the Tiger's track or transmission. The air was filled with the metallic clang of non-penetrating hits, the sharp crack of armor, piercing rounds finding their mark, and the screams of burning men. The Luftwaffe and the Red Air Force fought a desperate, swirling dogfight overhead, dropping bombs and strafing targets so close together that they often hit their own men. The fields around Prokhorovka became a scrapyard, littered with hundreds of burning, blackened hulls. By the end of the day, the fields were silent, save for the crackle of fires and the cries of the wounded. The Battle of Prokhorovka was over. On a tactical level, it had been a devastating loss for the Red Army. General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, the cream of the Soviet strategic reserve, had been massacred. They had lost over 400 of their 850 tanks, a catastrophic 50% loss rate in a single day. The Germans, by contrast, had lost fewer than 80 machines, though many more were damaged. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, though battered and exhausted, still held the field. But this tactical victory was a complete and utter strategic defeat. The 5th Guards Tank Army, in its suicidal, costly, and unbelievably brave charge, had done exactly what Zhukov needed it to do. The German spearhead was stopped. It was out of fuel. It was low on ammunition. Its tanks were in desperate need of repair, and its men were at the absolute limit of human endurance. The great southern pincer, the Wehrmacht's last hope, was broken. It had failed to reach Kursk. It had failed to link up with Model's defeated army in the north. It had failed, full stop. And now, the real trap was about to spring. While Hitler, Manstein, and Hoth had been obsessively focused on the fight at Prokhorovka, Zhukov was already looking at a different map. The defensive battle, Oberona, was over. The offensive phase was about to begin. On that same day, July 12th, as the tanks were burning at Prokhorovka, hundreds of miles to the north, the Soviet High Command unleashed Operation Citadel. This was the true counterpunch. A massive, fresh force from the Soviet Bryansk and Western fronts, which had been waiting patiently, smashed into the Ural salient, the very salient from which Model's 9th Army had launched its failed attack. Model's army, its best panzer units already chewed up and its flanks stripped, was hit by a force of over 1,200,000 men and 2,400 tanks. The German front didn't just bend, it shattered. Suddenly, the 9th Army wasn't attacking. It was in a desperate fight for its own survival. The news hit German high command like a physical blow. Then it got worse. On July 13th, Hitler convened a frantic, panicked meeting with Manstein and Field Marshal von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center, at his Wolf's Lair headquarters. As the generals were trying to explain the desperate situation at Kursk, an aide handed Hitler a telegram with even more disastrous news. On July 10th, the Allies, the British and Americans, had landed in Sicily. Operation Husky was underway, and Italy, Germany's main ally, was on the verge of total collapse. This was the final, fatal straw. Hitler, his mind now on a two-front war, flew into a rage. He declared that Citadel was over. It was a failure. He needed his elite divisions, specifically the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, The only force that still had any offensive power, to be pulled out of Russia immediately and sent to Italy. Manstein was horrified. He argued desperately that he was on the verge of a tactical victory in the south, that one more push could destroy the Soviet reserves. But it was useless. Hitler's focus was gone. The strategic initiative was gone. The last best chance had been squandered. The order stood. The offensive was canceled. The withdrawal was a signal to the Soviets. On August 3rd, as the Germans were desperately trying to contain the disaster at Orel, Stavka launched its southern counteroffensive, Operation Rumyantsev. Fresh Soviet armies, spearheaded by the remnants of the 5th Guards tank army, smashed into the same German armies that had just bled themselves white, trying to take Kursk. The result was a total rout. The exhausted German forces, with no reserves, no air support, and their best panzer divisions being pulled out for Italy, collapsed. Kharkov, the city Manstein had brilliantly recaptured in March, was liberated by the Red Army for the final time on August 23rd. The Battle of Kursk was over. The Germans had lost over 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. They had lost 1,500 of their best tanks and assault guns. But the most devastating loss was one that could not be measured in numbers. They had lost the Panzerwaffe, their elite armored fist. The brand new Panthers, rushed to the front, had been a mechanical disaster, with more loss to breakdown than to enemy fire. The mighty Ferdinands were rusting in minefields. The irreplaceable Tigers had been worn down and destroyed. This was Germany's last strategic reserve, and they had sacrificed it willingly on the strongest, most well-prepared, and most perfectly foreknown defensive position in the history of war. The Germans had walked into a trap. They knew it was a trap. They saw the fortifications, and they attacked anyway, blinded by their own arrogance and their faith in a technological superiority that was no longer decisive. From this moment on, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative was lost permanently. For the next 2 years, the German army would be in a state of constant, bloody, and hopeless retreat. The road to Berlin had been opened. The Red Army, having learned to outthink, out-engineer, and outfight its enemy, was now the unstoppable force. The battle for the invincible myth of the Wehrmacht had begun in Stalingrad with a logistical strangulation. It ended, definitively, in the minefields and pock fronts of Kursk, with a strategic and intellectual checkmate